we approached Patricia and VDEC about getting a mental health component to this conference. And I'm a neuroscientist by training. I've worked in the biotech industry for the better part of 30 years, looking at novel therapies for mental health. And we have a great panel here together. As a neuroscientist, I won't get too geeky with you guys. What I want to do is set expectations, because the way our brain works, the way it learns, is that if you have certainty and clarity about a situation, you're much more able to retain information and take it in. So the objective for this panel is really something simple. We want to take something that's invisible, right? Think about mental health, emotional struggles, and make it visible. Okay, and we have a great panel here to do that. People who have experience, tremendous experience in the academic realm, in data, in practical application, in philanthropy. So we really wanted to make the case to you that that mental health is, as Kelly talks about, I love this term, a public health crisis. And when you look at the effort and the money that we put into medicine and medical therapies, compared to what mental health, the burden it has on society and people as a whole, there's a big discrepancy, and we can do better. So my hope at the end of this panel is you understand that. And as investors, you have a little bit of insight into why the time is now to invest in mental health. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. I want to go through and have quick introductions by the panel to just give a little bio of themselves, because it's a pretty impressive panel. We'll start with Kelly.
We have to brag about ourselves?
You have to brag, yes.
So I'm a professor of psychiatry at Columbia, but I am the lead scientist of what has become the global method of detection for suicide risk, something called the Columbia Protocol, which is policy across every state, across the continuum of care, every nation across the world, and has had profound impact on, morbidity, mortality, et cetera. It's a fantastic example of what investment, can actually do.
And if you look on your chairs, there is a QR code for the Columbia Protocol that Kelly's talking about.
And to say about the investment, you would see in my braggy bio, right? President Obama's Secretary of Education, these questions can keep our whole nation safe. I was awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for exceptional public service because they were the first ones to show if we do this innovation, leverage technology, put it in all hands, we can address these public health crises.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly. Margaret.
I'm Margaret Hines. I am both a funder and a founder. I have over 15 years experience in VC and private equity. I do a lot of impact investing, but I also am married to a Golden Gate Bridge jump survivor, so I have lived experience in that sense. So we do a lot of policy work about we work on getting barriers and suicide prevention nets on bridges and buildings and parking structures to prevent suicides. I'm very passionate about driving capital into the behavioral healthcare space. And I've been focusing the past 12 years of my life on producing film with my husband, all impact film that obviously prevents suicide but also promotes mental health.
Thanks, Margaret. Jono?
Yep, I am Jono Wilde. I'm the executive director of the Good Life Movement, which is a mental health nonprofit, and we're focused on writing a mental health civil rights bill. And I found my way to this work after witnessing my father's struggle with bipolar disorder. He was suffering from the disease, which was bad enough, but then watching as the medical industry, insurance practices, and society writ large failed him time and time again. We lost him to suicide in 2024, and that's what's really motivating our work to write a mental health civil rights bill that we're calling the Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness Act, because ultimately what we're talking about here are actually some of the principles that this country was founded on, the idea of agency, autonomy, being able to captain our own ship, and we feel like it's high time America delivers on that promise. Thank you.
Thanks, Jono. And Rachel.
Yes, hi. So glad to be here. My name is Rachel Butler. I am the president of the Catalytic Impact Foundation. We are a not-for-profit that accelerates innovation in areas of high unmet medical needs. So we take philanthropic capital, we pool it, And we run it like an early stage venture fund, except we have no LPs or GPs. We are focused solely on impact and focused in areas of healthcare where, for whatever reason, there is high need and there are challenges to funding innovation. Mental health and brain and mental health is a huge area of focus for us. I think like everyone probably in this room, both through family and friends, we've been touched by mental health crises, suicide, and it's an area that we really zeroed in on because there have been so few innovations. Many of the drugs and the therapeutics that are available now have been available for decades with not a lot of new options. So it's an area we're quite focused on to try and change that dynamic.
Thanks, Rachel. So a lot of experience on this panel. I really want to start though with Kelly. Your input in terms of, so I had this experience on the subway recently where there was someone who had a crutch and their ankle was taped up. All right, and they were walking and people were very cordial, getting out of their way, helping them because it was something you could see. It was a physical disability you could see. And then I thought about what we're talking about here. It's hidden. We don't see what people are struggling with. And that goes to the visible versus invisible. And as humans, we've got about half of our brain that deals with vision. So if you can't see it, it doesn't really exist. And it could be threatening to some extent because we don't understand it. How do we make that invisible visible? What are you doing to bring that to light?
Yeah, they suffer in silence. And you know, let me just back up and say that the name of this panel is, right, suicide and depression, you know, touches everyone. I really want to really paint you this stark picture, right? Suicide and depression cost humanity more than anything, more global burden than we've ever seen. But the good news, I'm going to keep coming back with good news, is the most dramatic return on investment. But let me again tell you the magnitude. You know, suicide takes more firemen than fire, more police than crime, more lives than car accidents. You know, 135 people are affected by every death, and these effects linger across generations because of the silence that often follows. Depression is the #1 cause of global disability. And just to put some numbers to that, 248 million people across the globe have depression versus 18 million with cancer, okay? And yet, the investment is so topsy-turvy. Get this, you know, we spend $37 million on depression treatment and $6.6 billion on cancer treatment, right? There was, you know, up until 2019, I think the NIH spent more money on the West Nile virus, which takes 137 lives, than suicide prevention. And you said $1 trillion in global productivity. When you add in healthcare, disability, premature mortality, in a few years, it's going to be $6 trillion, okay, globally. And what about workforce? Do you know that depression is the #1 cause of work-related absences? And if you take a large corporation of 100,000 employees, every 6 days an employee or a family member will die by suicide, and every single day there will be 3 family suicide attempts, right? But what we do know is that we can do something about it. You know, we have treatments that work. You know that since we have SSRIs, the simplest treatments that, you know, the #1 prescription most places across the world, since we have them, the suicide rate has dropped dramatically across the world, across ages, reversing a trend prior to their introduction. However, most people who need these simple, potent medicines don't get them because of stigma and access. And so that's so critical. You know, autopsy studies invariably show that suicides are related to no treatment or lack of compliance, right? So we know that not treating depression is what kills people. And so what we know what to do. Do you know that we are the only developed nation in the world where the life expectancy is going in the wrong direction? It's not going up, it's going down. And we don't have a cure for cancer, and we don't have a cure for heart disease, but we actually do know how to cure this. And I was talking about the impact of detection, right? So we have to identify people who are depressed, identify people who are at suicidal risk. That's why my work has had such impact, right? Because people suffer in silence. We need to do it upstream. We need to have a public health approach, which is what you were talking about. Did you know, largest study ever done, 67 studies across the world, the overwhelming majority of people who take their lives never get close to a doctor, never get close to a mental health diagnosis. What does that mean? We have to go upstream in all hands. You know what? The Department of Defense were the first ones to test that. There was an urgent memo out of the Pentagon that we must put the Columbia in all hands because people don't get to the doctor. So the Marines tested this. Legal assistance, financial aid, counselors, spouses, they lowered suicide 22%. And this public health approach, finding people where they work, live, and thrive, like we do with lots of other things, has been a game changer. And when you said, you know, what do? We talked about workforce, right? And how this touches every workforce. What is the solution? Do you know that Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security has their own Columbia Protocol app, which you see in front of you. So if you're Secret Service or Border Protection, they have automatic downloads. Do you know ICE hasn't had a suicide in almost 3 years since the Columbia Protocol app? Meaning, what it can put back into the system in terms of productivity, in terms of innovation is really, you know, again, a great return on investment.
And that's amazing, because you're talking a practical tool that is not that complex.
Yeah.
The development of it was, but the implementation of it is quite, if you download the app, you will see how simplistic it is, yet the power of it.
Oh, and I did want to say one other thing in terms of disparities that are so striking. You know, we've made progress. Did you know in 2019 and 20, even during COVID, we had our first reductions in the suicide rate after 20 years of increases? But the big caveat was these reductions were only among white Americans. You know what the CDC told us? 5-year-old suicide has increased, but only among black children, right? And we know what we need to do to address these disparities, but it takes a lot of investment. What we also know is that 80% of people who take their lives, kids, adults, workforce, do it in their homes, right? So how do we leverage technology, leverage innovation, leverage detection to get in every home and every pocket? And what that requires are public health campaigns like we did with smoking, and seatbelts, and that's, you know, it's really, really, really important.
That's the bringing the visibility piece of it. I myself am passionate about this because I have 2 grandchildren who will be coming up into a family that I have a very strong history of depression and mental illness, and it's scary. And so this ability to leverage technology, particularly in the kids, the teens, who, let's face it, they don't want to go on an SSRI. I was told, you know, by a 13-year-old patient going through puberty, I don't want to gain weight. You give me a pill, I'm not taking it. So then the compliance is gone, and now what do they do, right?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up. You know, when all these things, you see on commercials, this medication could cause you to be suicidal. So I was the person that led the team that was commissioned by the FDA to make sense of all that. And actually, there's never been a medicine that's ever caused anybody to be suicidal. It's actually the underlying disease that's associated with risk. So the FDA mandates the Columbia for second time in their history, right? It's led to removal of black boxes, showing that medications work and what they need to do, and that's really important. And you know what we saw? We saw a horrible natural experiment. We saw these unnecessary black boxes. What happened? People stopped taking medicine, and suicide went up. So we've started to reverse that, and I did want to say the other thing that this connects to is gun violence, right? This unbelievable thing we've all been reeling from for decades. And did you know that, I'm talking about how investment in detection even impacts that? Did you know that 90% of shooters have suicidal issues? So let's find them. You know that the Parkland community, they say that, you know, we found the first thing to interrupt the pathway to violence, this upstream detection with the Columbia. The Secret Service did a study of 67 prevented attacks. You know what they found? They're preventable when communities ID warning signs upstream. And when Department of Homeland Security came out with their app, you know what the articles said? This is nutrition and physical fitness. We have to treat these issues like wellness, and that breaks down the lethal barriers of stigma.
So that's a great segue to Margaret. The practical application, the youth, the teens, leveraging technology for good in this case. You can speak to that a little bit, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because my husband, I mentioned to somebody earlier, we travel 250 to 300 days a year, and we get in front of probably 100,000 youth in person every year. Not to mention, obviously, the social media platforms that he's on and the videos that reach them. And, you know, one of the things, listening to Kelly speak, how old do you think the youngest person in the United States is to die by suicide? It's not 5 years old, it's 4. I was shocked to hear this. I was shocked to meet many parents of 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds that died by suicide. So when my husband speaks, runs workshops, and counsels a lot of these kids, I get to witness this. So after several years of realizing that there are not enough resources for youth, I decided to build a platform. So we're not going to get our kids off their phones. They're going to stay on their phones. That's fine. Thankfully, in the state of New York, the kids are no longer on their phones in classrooms, which is, I think, great. However, I think, you know, kids are going to ChatGPT and they're going to TikTok and they're getting advice, therapeutic advice. I don't think we can stop that, not the way that we're allowing them to utilize their phones and their iPads. So what we did was we built an app called Navi that's based in single session intervention, which is a very targeted therapeutic. It is non-diagnostic, it's self-directed, it is digitally delivered. And so we basically are giving kids in the state of New York, states of Nevada, Pennsylvania, New Mexico now, Oregon, and Indiana, California eventually. We're talking to the state of California for the states to roll out these interventions. So the kids, in addition to going to TikTok, in addition to going to ChatGPT, they also have an additional solution that's evidence-based, very targeted therapy. Generative AI is not being utilized in the content because we do not feel that it is safe. We'll leave that to ChatGPT. We don't want that liability. The Columbia is embedded in the app, so we actually have safety guidelines in there and crisis support resources that connect the kids either to 988 or to existing in-person resources within their county and their states. And so this was kind of my attempt to help these kids, because what else is there? So as we continue to get in front of the youth, we actually ask them to come and help us build the app, design the app. And there's, you know, it's a saturated market, the youth mental health app. It is completely saturated, but we're the only single session intervention app in the United States. And single session intervention is really interesting. It's an interesting modality. Not very popular here in the US yet until we completely move into a value-based healthcare system. Very popular in Europe, very popular in Canada and in Australia because they have a more socialistic healthcare approach. So the value-based healthcare system is focused on outcomes. So more outcomes, more effective outcomes, less cost. So there is a 75 to 85% drop-off after the first therapy session. That's traditional therapy. So this particular modality actually captures the patient or the user in the first session. Guarantees a solution, guarantees accountability, and then we gamify it so the kids are coming back to use it. And so this is our first year out, and we'll see how it works, but utilizing AI can be really effective and safe, and that's how we're using Navi.
And I know you also do a lot about storytelling. And storytelling is fascinating to me as a neuroscientist because of the ability for people to have a better comprehension and understanding and relate to things, information with a story. Tell us about that.
Sure. Stories are 22 times more memorable than facts. period. So, as I mentioned earlier, my husband is a Golden Gate Bridge jump survivor. Many of his keynotes are obviously about his story. His story is compelling, et cetera, but when you share a story that is basically about triumph over adversity and gives people hope, you actually are embedding these systems in their brain. There's data to support. They remember these stories. And a lot of the kids that we talk to, that he speaks to early on, and he's been doing this for 20 years now, they've graduated from college. A lot of them are therapists, a lot of them are psychiatrists, and a lot of them are in the behavioral health care field, behavioral health tech founders, and they go right back to him. They send him messages and they say, I'm doing this because of you, because you came to my 4th grade class. You came to my 9th grade class, and I'll never forget your story. I was fine then, but I went through a divorce 10 years later, or I went through some sort of trauma. Your story saved my life. And it's just one story. So we saw that impact. And yes, obviously his story is low-hanging fruit for us, because that's the story that we have that is effective. But I honestly believe anybody that has a story of hope and triumph over adversity can save a life.
And I saw his documentary, and just his storytelling, it was incredibly impactful to have the one gentleman say, your story saved my life, period.
Yeah. We actually collected all the data on his story, not all, most of it for several years. So several of his videos have gone viral. One of them actually has over almost 4 billion views currently to date, and that particular video has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. So we actually had it qualified and quantified. So now his story and the way he shares it is actually an evidence-based program in and of itself.
Can I take 45 seconds and actually tell the story? So
Tell us the story.
Kevin woke up, age 19, said, if just one person asks me if I'm okay, I won't do it. Gets on the bus to the Golden Gate Bridge, crying profusely. What's wrong with that kid? Shoot off the bus, goes to the side of the bridge. Finally, this woman walks towards him, and he becomes hopeful. And she says, can you take my picture? Forgive my horrible German accent. But 5 times, she said, can you take my picture? And he said, screw this, nobody cares. And he jumped. And as he jumped, like every other survivor, all he wanted to do was survive and realize that all of the problems in his life were fixable, except the fact that he just jumped. And he said, people considering suicide want someone to save them. What we need is a culture where no one is afraid to ask him. By the way, he gets down in the water. It's fatal 99% of the time, jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. Gets down in the water, realizes he's alive, and feels something slimy. He says, oh my God, I just survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. Now I'm going to get eaten by a shark. Just my luck. And he's on a show a few months later, and this guy calls in and says, hey, buddy, I'm so happy you were alive. I was standing next to you, but it wasn't a shark. It was a sea lion that kept him afloat. He was meant to tell this life-saving story.
And the millisecond his hand actually left the rail, he had an instant regret. And many survivors that obviously we come in contact with from a variety of different methods have said the same thing.
And it goes back to that invisibility, the stigma attached, not just to come out and talk about it, but for people to go out there and talk to you about it. Jono, how do we, what is the Good Life movement doing to help with this? From a political perspective, a societal perspective, how do we just change our basic thought process around this as a society?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize, too, you don't need a PhD in this stuff to recognize that we do not treat mental health with the same reverence that we do physical health in this country. An easy test would be to apply the John Rawls test for a just society, where we ask ourselves, would we want to live in a society if we did not know first what station we'd be born into? And if there's any scenario in which you would hesitate to be born into, be it a gender or a race or having a predisposition for a certain kind of disease, that's where our society is lacking. And so for our conversations today, the question can be, how many of us would like our chances if we were born with a predisposition for bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or just major depressive disorder? And I think part of the challenge, too, with the way we talk about it, is understanding that mental health doesn't only mean the bad stuff. I mean, that's what makes the headlines, right? But mental health can also be the positive days that you're having. It's the same way our physical health, some days we're feeling good, other days we're not feeling good. I think if we can change the conversation so that mental health doesn't only mean mental illness, but actually encompasses the full continuum of our human condition, then we can start to change the way that we're talking about it, and it can be more accessible if it's just the same sort of casual, benign conversations that we have if we have a stomach ache or a headache. If I'm having anxiety or a panic attack, I should be able to approach that with the same objectivity that I would any kind of physical ailment.
And you mentioned earlier, the basic Bill of Rights is what you see in your philanthropic movement, pursuit of happiness. How are you trying to operationalize that from a political perspective or?
Yeah, so the idea behind a omnibus mental health civil rights bill is that we want it to serve as both a fulcrum for the mental health space, because there are a lot of different organizations doing a lot of different work, but we want it to be the supporting mechanism for all of it, but then also to be a heuristic device or an educational device for the general public. And we look at other social movements in the past, and I think the ones that have been successful have had a single message or a single goal that they were able to rally the public around. And so while there's been a ton of work in the mental health space, and there's been a ton of policy, and we've seen mental health parity laws passed, and even going back to 1963, Kennedy passed a Community Care Act, and then he was assassinated 3 weeks later, and so all the political momentum was gone. Jimmy Carter passed a patient Bill of Rights, not only for mental health, but physical health, and then in '81, Reagan walked that back. So there have been efforts, and we have seen progress, but it's been in fits and starts, and if we can coalesce the entire industry around one message, one bill, and say this is the target that we're aiming at, we feel that that's more achievable to hopefully get what is an omnibus bill that includes a handful of different titles, but it all touches on things that we've already talked about and we've already done, but the idea is to package it and to mainstream it.
And a big part of this sounds like it's equity too, an equitable from insurance reimbursement to patient access and all these types of things as well.
Yeah, and then even just making it so that if someone's having a manic episode and you call 911 instead of, if I were to have a heart attack, let's say, and you all were concerned, you call 911 for me, an ambulance shows up, it takes me to the hospital where they have all the medicine and the wherewithal and the knowledge to help me, right? Life-saving medicine, life-saving surgeries. If I were to have a manic episode and you call 911, it's not an ambulance that shows up, it's a police car. And I don't get taken to a hospital, I get taken to prison. And so changing even just the way that our society responds to these kind of crises, but then also addressing it upstream so that it doesn't even manifest and get to that point would be the ideal goal, yeah.
And so I know I want to be cognizant of the time here, leave some time for questions. Rachel, you're on the other end of this. You're on the investment space, and you can maybe speak to this audience a little bit in terms of the mental health. I know you have a vertical of mental health and brain. What have you seen in terms of willingness to invest, some of the hesitancy and some of the impact or ROI from what you've done?
Yeah, so, is that on? Oh, there. So yes, as I mentioned in my introduction, this is an area that has not seen as much innovation and progress as other areas of healthcare for other diseases and conditions. There are a number of reasons for that. One of those is that over the years there have been tremendous number of failures. The brain is a very complicated organ and hard to understand, hard to access, hard to sort of monitor, affect. And because of that, that really put a damper on investment in this space. So one of the reasons that we, as a impact investor, where we can go into fund things that others won't because of the whole sort of risk-benefit analysis, we felt this was a huge, really important area for us to focus on. One of the things that is really positive and one of the changes that we're seeing is that, we have now much better ways to see inside the brain, to monitor, much better brain imaging, finding of biomarkers, better diagnostics. And so as a result, I think it's a really optimistic time for new treatments, new therapeutics, better diagnostics, and so we're excited to be able to be in this space, to be investing in some of these early stage companies that are doing really like remarkable things. I can give you a couple of examples. One of the companies that we invested in, I think one of the founders is on the next panel, is called Dionysus Health. They have developed a blood test to predict, in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, to predict your likelihood or predisposition toward postpartum depression. And I think this is a problem that is not fully understood or given enough importance, because if you look at, sadly, you had mentioned how the numbers on longevity in this country are going down instead of up. So suicide following the first year after childbirth is the number 2 reason that women die during that period. And I think there's so much shame around it, that a woman has a new baby and is really hesitant to tell her doctor that she wants to kill herself and her baby, and that she actually hates this beautiful baby. So this blood test that's given in the 3rd trimester not just predicts your likelihood, doesn't mean you're going to get postpartum depression, but predicts the likelihood of that. And as a result, they can get a referral. They know that this is not a failure on their part, but a medical issue that they should be aware of. We also have a company that we invested in that does fMRI imaging of the brain. And this can be, it's an amazing team out of Harvard, psychiatrist and someone who ran imaging at Harvard Medical School. And they can use this for a number of things, better diagnostics. So if someone comes into, and this is what, they're not here yet, but what they're working toward is that it can be used in the clinic. So often when someone has a mental health condition, they go to the doctor, and it might be 6 months to a year of trial and error. It's very difficult to be diagnosed correctly, very difficult to find the right drug that will work for you, very difficult to find the right dosage of that drug. And what they're working toward is to be able to use biomarkers in the brain, fMRI imaging to help treat, both diagnose and treat quickly and effectively versus, this very long period of trial and error, which often has terrible outcomes. So there's a lot going on, and I think that I really sort of go back to the understanding of biomarkers, better brain imaging, that's certainly making me very optimistic that there is going to be a lot more innovation in this space, and better therapeutics, better diagnostics, and also I would add telehealth has been a huge area since COVID. It's unbelievable to me that it wasn't more available before COVID, but it took that to get us to understand that you don't always have to be in your doctor's office. You had mentioned access before. We invest in the company that 2 women psychiatrists who started a sort of tech-enabled, AI-enabled telehealth platform for women really throughout their life span, but really focusing on pregnancy through the first year following childbirth. And they can't meet the demand. They are growing in leaps and bounds, and really creating access for people who would not have otherwise had access to psychiatric care, or making it easier so they actually choose to, I think especially in mental health, sometimes it's nice not to be in the same room with eye contact. And I think telehealth has a huge opportunity in expanding access to treatment in the mental health space.